Thank you, everybody. I appreciate everybody joining us today for the webinar. We're going to focus on FRA compliance for contractors, covering both Parts 219 and Part 243. Before we do that, I see a lot of familiar names in the attendee list, but real quick, a little bit about Spark. If you haven't heard of us before, we have a software application called Railtasker, and as a company, we're really dedicated to compliance, which is one of the reasons we are happy to host these webinars. And I think one of the things that makes us unique is that we don't just offer software, we are really committed to making sure our customers succeed and providing the service they need, whether they're a short line with 2 people or a small contractor or some of our larger holding companies and Class 1 clients. We have Holly Rainwater here to talk through 219, and then I will cover the 243 questions and content. I think between the two of us, we'll be able to answer your guys' questions. And if for any reason something comes up we cannot answer, Holly and I will check in with FRA and get back to you. But we'll begin with an overview of the Part 219 contractor compliance, and then go into the requirements for 243 and some of the questions that are coming up since that's a newer regulation. I'm going to hand it over to Holly.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. For 219, which is the FRA drug and alcohol program, there are some responsibilities that as the employer or designated employer representative that you should do. The first thing is when you know you're going to have a contractor is notify those contractors in advance of their responsibilities. And the reason for that is that some contractors will automatically understand that. Maybe it's a larger contractor, they've been under these regulations before, they understand. But if you have a smaller contractor, maybe a small company that's maybe 2 or 3 people, and the railroad industry is just a portion of their job, they may not understand those responsibilities. I would also recommend obtaining confirmation before they perform regulated service, and then do your due diligence to ensure that they receive a summary, or that you receive summary data to show their compliance. The regulation in 219.9 subpart or number C says that the contractor is responsible for compliance, but if you continue to read through that regulation at the bottom, it does say that the FRA can hold that railroad or other entity jointly responsible and liable for compliance. As a railroader or as a person that has a contractor working for them, ultimately the railroad could be held responsible for compliance. And some of the things that we're, next slide please, that we're recommending is the contractor acknowledgement of 219 compliance. If you ask, is your company compliant in these portions of the regulation? And if they answer yes or no to this, that might be one way to help verify that you have done your due diligence to go through. That would include making sure that they're training their employees, their supervisors, they're doing required testing like post-accident, suspicion, cause, random, and pre-employment. Also that they're doing their 40.25 checks and they're compliant with Part 40 procedures, including the Subpart O, the return to duty, the SAP process, and also conducting the appropriate number of Rule G observations, because those contractors are still ultimately responsible for the same things that you as a railroad are responsible for. Next slide, please. And additionally, the 219 summary data should be provided to you every 6 months, and that would be an example of an MIS report and an ongoing approved employee roster with that data of that negative pre-employment test. If they're providing you a MIS report every 6 months, you can understand that they probably are doing what they need to do to ensure due diligence with the regulation. Other information that we would suggest is getting that company's contact information. Who is their DER? What is that DER's phone number? Where are they located? Because if a situation does occur, you can reach out to that contractor to talk to that DER to find out any discrepancies or maybe if there's a testing event that needs to occur, you've got that person to talk to. Also recommending getting their FRA drug and alcohol plan and approval letter. In my past experiences, the contractor may think they are compliant with the regulation, and after I have reviewed their drug and alcohol plan, I found out that they've maybe sent me their FMCSA plan or even their company plan, and are nowhere near compliant with 219. That is some of our recommendations for compliance with 219.
Thanks, Holly. One of the reasons I wanted to make sure we talked about both regulations is as we move into talking about 243, really there's similar requirements that railroads have. And I've been talking to FRA and others in the industry, and we have found that really it's the same group of people, especially now with the recent change to Part 219, to include the mechanical employees. When we talk about Part 243 compliance for contractors, it's really the same group of contractors. The responsibility the railroad has for Part 243 is, again, to notify them ahead, advance their responsibilities, just like Part 219. You want to make sure they're compliant before they perform any covered service, or I put regulated service, but really we're talking about safety sensitive jobs that are covered by Part 243 here, which is a wider scope, I would say. Oh, actually, no, it's the same scope. We just covered that. Sorry, we're used to thinking of it that way, but now with mechanical, it is the same scope. And then maintain a list of those contractors with the information shown on the screen. I will say this is still something that comes up at least weekly, where I'm answering questions with contractors as well as for railroads on different things that are needed. I just want to emphasize too, the contractors' responsibilities. They need to be in full compliance with the Part 243 regulation, ensuring that their safety-related employees are qualified. They had the ability to grandfather them in, just like the railroads did. And then the big piece that's misunderstood frequently by contractors is they're going to have that responsibility of periodic oversight, which is similar to an efficiency test or an operations test that a railroad conducts. Now, as a railroad, you can use your Part 217 operations testing plan for periodic oversight. However, if you are a contractor, this would be a new requirement, and I know FRA is putting together a template this summer to help support contractors in completing periodic oversight, as well as if for those of you who are association members with the Short Line Association, there's something in the works also to support contractors as well as railroads with that. There's a lot that could be said on periodic oversight. The regulation does have an exception, and I put possible exception because there's some nuances to that for any contractors less than 15 employees. But my experience really is that railroads are putting that responsibility back on the contractors. If you're a contractor with 2 or 3 people, the truth is that it's very likely your customers are gonna expect that you provide your own periodic oversight and maintain those records. The only exceptions I'm really seeing is if you contractors who are really a 1099 employee and one individual, and in some cases I have seen where the railroad treats that 1099 employee as if they were a railroad employee and incorporate them into their training and periodic oversight and so forth. And I put full compliance, but I just want to note that contractors aren't required to do the annual reviews that are part of 243. And if you're a short line, it's likely true that you also don't need to do those annual reviews. That would be for any railroad with more than 400,000 total work hours. Great. Oops. Just some of the questions we get. And again, this is probably what is coming up weekly, is what kind of documentation does the railroad need? And there is some confusion on this, specifically because the regulation and the 243 compliance manual are out of sync. I'll just summarize this. These are some of the questions we got. Rob Castiglione from FRA talked through these in a past webinar not too long ago. But in the compliance manual for 243, it lists on pages 8 through 11 regulations that do not require a submission, and that is true whether you're a railroad or a contractor. Now, as a railroad, you still need to get confirmation that your contractors are compliant with Part 243. That could be in the form of a letter or even an email stating that they are compliant. I really recommend that it's not just like a, yes, we're compliant with Part 243, but similar to what Holly was pointing out on Part 219, where she listed the different pieces of things in the certification, the different tests and the different portions of Part 219. I would also do something like that in your request or in the letter, especially saying that we're compliant with Part 243, including the periodic oversight, because most contractors that I talk to in the last few months that I hadn't talked to previously still don't understand that part of the regulation. And so making sure you're getting certification on not just the training requirements, but also the periodic oversight, I think is important. So I'll go through some of these questions that we've been getting. Do they need to provide a copy of the approval letter for each course? And the answer is the railroad may want copies of approval letters if they need to submit those approval letters. If not, then the letter I just talked about would be sufficient. For example, if a maintenance away contractor, they do not need to do any submissions if they're not doing anything for signal or anything of that nature. In that case, a letter would be sufficient. For a signal contractor, parts 234 and parts 236 do require submission. In that case, the railroad would want an approval letter. I would say if you needed to get an approval as a railroad, you would want to get that approval letter from a contractor for the portions that they were required to submit. But keep in mind, a signal maintainer may have an approval letter for the wayside signal maintenance and inspections, but they would not have an approval letter, for example, for on-track safety. Again, 243 is a little more complex in that nature. If a contract is required to qualify employees on a CFR part, but does not require an approval program, such as on-track safety, is the email saying they're trained sufficient? And that is probably the biggest question we get. And again, yes, but I would make sure they clarify different portions of the regulation, including periodic oversight. Does the railroad need approval letters for if they're being trained by a training organization or a learning institute? That's that acronym there. Again, so if as a railroad, if you're taking, let's say, a Spark training course, all of our approval letters are in our learning management system in the handouts. You have access to those, so do our contractor clients. I have seen multiple times where contractors are providing copies of a learning institution's approval letters to the railroad customers as evidence of compliance. That's not required, again, if it's not required to be submitted to FRA. But if you are a contractor, you most certainly do want a copy of those approval letters if you're using training for training of your own employees. And the same thing is true for a railroad. I've talked to a few folks, it was probably last month, where they always trained with a specific organization and they had not yet received approval letters from FRA on the training that they were providing. Learning institutions and training organizations have been required to have approved training in the industry for quite a while now, I think January 1st of 2021. And if you're training your own employees and you're using external vendors, just make sure that you have those approval letters. And if you're a railroad and your contractor is doing that and it's not required to be submitted for FRA, you don't need a copy of those. I think I've covered that quite sufficiently, but if there's more questions, send them my way. Okay, the last question, and we posed this to FRA. I'll just talk through the question and what was said. If a contractor provides documentation like we discussed to a railroad that their training is compliant, it's just going to be a generic letter, and later the FRA determines that the contractor is not compliant, will the railroad be held responsible? And I remember Rob saying maybe, like it just depends probably on circumstances and what happened. I think that most likely, again, this is why when you get those certification letters, not making them generic and making sure, for example, that they include the different portions of the regulation. And I'm happy to provide a suggestion after the webinar of what that could look like. But one of the concerns in the industry is the misunderstanding of the requirement for on-the-job training. No longer can we just take an online course or a classroom course and become an employee in charge or a lone worker or inspect a freight car. We really need those hands-on training components. If that was something that was found deficient, I would just make sure your certification for the contractors includes, maybe calls out initial training, including hands-on training when required and periodic oversight. I think that would help in these circumstances. This follows up to what I was just saying about on-the-job training. How does a railroad ensure the contractor is getting the proper on-the-job training and not using the partial program? This is continuing to be a big concern, especially when it comes to Part 214 with on-track safety And there is some joint responsibility, as we just talked about, especially if they're working on your property and getting that hands-on training for on-track safety. We can talk more if there's anyone has a specific circumstance to talk through. Can a railroad require contractors with less than 15 employees to provide their periodic oversight? And the answer is yes, you can do that. But would the follow-up question, there's not a question mark, which gave me a pause, sorry, but would FRA hold both responsible if there was a deficiency? And I've heard FRA more than once say that's likely that they would go back to the railroad to make sure the periodic oversight is being performed. Again, as a new regulation, we are in a little bit of uncharted waters of what that looks like. I have some thoughts on this that I thought to help limit compliance for my railroad clients and things that our customers who are contractors can do to demonstrate compliance. But similar, when we talk about those 6-month reports that are done in Part 219, in the regulation, it says you need to get information to show that they're compliant, and Holly can correct the exact wording, but it doesn't specifically lay out what that is. I think in time, the same thing's gonna hold true with Part 243. It's not a regulatory requirement that railroads get detailed information on oversight, but I think maybe an annual report or something that shows that's being done just at a very high level might be something to limit your regulatory risk on that point. Because I would say with all of the conferences we just went through this past spring, that was a theme that I heard from FRAs and Rob saying that he would hold both possibly responsible if there was an incident. Again, if you guys have specific questions, I'm happy to dive into it further, but maybe some best practices. And I'll follow up with a blog post on some of these pointers within the next week and put in some recommended practices and maybe run those by a few others in the industry before I post that. You can look for that. And then it's a new regulation, so a lot of questions on enforcement. And we've been asking FRA this since 2012 and had a very consistent response from FRA. So the FRA has a Part 243 team. It's made up of 3 people, and they're really responsible for the submissions and the standards of the regulation. Local inspectors can look for training records and say, okay, what does it take to be a track inspector? And then ensure that track inspector has all the required training to be qualified as a track inspector per your 243 plan. They can definitely look at that record, those records, to make sure that somebody is properly qualified, but it really should be the 243 team at FRA, meaning Rob Castiglione, Corey Johnson, or Brian Riley, as far as looking at the quality of the submission and things of that nature. That's the answer we've been getting from FRA, and it's too bad Corey's not here to clarify, but I have heard them speak to that several times this spring. Let's see, one more slide, I think. I really wanted to pick on maintenance away because most of our contractor questions are specific to maintenance away, especially because of on-track safety. Yes, roadway workers do need to be qualified under Part 243, but they are the one example to the second bullet point that does not require on-the-job training if they're truly, let's call them basic roadway workers. That means they're not handling a switch, not handling a fixed derail, they're not a machine operator, they're not a lone worker, they're not a flagman. They're really working as a basic roadway worker. In that case, that is the only example that we can think of under Part 243 that would not require on-the-job training. That can change very quickly, but that is the case. Now, let's see. If a contractor performs track repair, but the railroad puts the track back into service, do they need those track safety standards qualifications under 213? And most likely not was the answer when we asked FRA this. They did bring up some examples where CWR might be a requirement if they're adding rail, or they got to make those calculations to ensure that the right CWR policies and procedures are being followed, but that was the response by FRA to that question. And then I've been alluding to this last question throughout the last couple of slides, but can a contractor work as a lone worker or employee in charge? And if so, what is required? So chatted with Corey yesterday and brought up that we would be talking about this, and he'd say it's more a 214 question, but one of the consistent things from FRA, both from Corey Johnson or from Lance at FRA, Hawks, is that when it comes to railroad on-track safety, the regulation does require that it's specific to each railroad's operating rules. And this can be really tricky for contractors who work on multiple properties. That said, if they're a lone worker working at a short line or a class 1, they need to be qualified on those specific railroads procedures of on-track safety for a lone worker, or the specific qualifications for an employee in charge. And this can get a little bit tricky of how that's done. I've had several thoughts and ideas that I've brainstormed with FRA to make it more manageable. One of the thoughts I have is having a core, let's say, employee in charge training, a core lone worker training, and then supplemental railroad training, specific training to make sure that piece is covered. And then keep in mind, those sorts of jobs do require initial hands-on training. If they were not grandfathered in, previously, they really need that hands-on initial training to be anything other than a roadway worker. Again, I think time will tell us as we get through more time having this regulation and affect some of the further interpretations from FRA, but just want to make sure people understand that is railroad specific. There is a hands-on component to manage with 243. And that is my last slide. Please reach out if you have questions after the webinar. Both Holly and I are happy to answer additional questions, but we appreciate your guys' time this afternoon or this morning to talk through some of the contractor compliance for both Part 219 and Part 243.